So, welcome Professor Stephen Robbins and welcome audience to this talk, which is arranged by Judisk Kultur in Sverige. You are a professor in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology in Stellenbosch, South Africa. And you have written this book, Letters of Stone, which we'll be talking about today. It was published in 2016, and it tracks your family roots. It's a kind of discovery. We follow your discovery of lives and fates of the Rubinski family, and you take us through South Africa. You take us to Berlin, to Riga, and to Auschwitz. All iconic places in different ways. And you also touch upon the subject of eugenics and racial science before the World War II, and we'll get back to that. But to begin with, you grew up in Port Elizabeth in South Africa, and you were living in a home where there was a particular item, a photograph, which is the starting point of a lot of things and the whole book, actually. Yeah, we can see it maybe soon. Okay. There they are, this photograph. 3 women, quite seriously watching us back, and they were in your dining room.
Yes, thank you very much. That photograph is right at the start of the book, and the chapter is called The Photograph because it was so central in so many ways. So what happened was I grew up, as you say, the photograph was in the dining room, and I always knew it was there. Interestingly, my brother didn't remember it being there. So, some of us are drawn to these images, and I was particularly drawn to Edith Rubinski on the left, and just wanting to know much later, of course, who she was. And in the middle is Cecily Rubinski, and on the right, Hildegard Rubinski. So the photograph becomes very important because I knew I was connected to these people through a very close family relationship, but I knew nothing about them. I didn't even really know their names, until much later. And again, it's this question of why didn't I want to know, why didn't I ask?
Yeah, this is my question to you. Yeah. Why didn't you ask?
It's a very good question. And I think it's got to do with young people are not necessarily drawn into history of their families. It's you're a young kid, you're playing football, you're interested in your friendships perhaps, and it never occurred to me that I needed to know who they were. I wasn't told, I didn't ask. And then the question of why I wasn't told and why there was a silence about these 3 women.
Because there was an actual silence surrounding this photograph? And
yes, I imagine in most or many homes there's a photograph that's of very close family members, and you know more about who they were. I only found out the names when I went to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and I went to the Resource Center, and the librarian there sort of started talking to me, and I mentioned that my family were murdered in the Holocaust, and he said, well, what was their names? I said, Rubinski, and he brought out this big Berliner Gedenk book and went through all the R's and came to Rubinski. And then I saw for the first time this list of the names of the family who didn't get out of Berlin. So my father and his younger brother got out in 36 and 38 respectively. And the rest of the family didn't. But at that point, and by then I was an adult, and I was interested in all of this. And it was around the mid-90s, and it was at a time when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was happening in South Africa, and I was writing in the media about what was going on. I was going to the hearings
and this is the response, the official response to the apartheid system being, officially declared over. So I just want to make it clear.
Yeah.
So you were writing about this process taking place in South Africa, which was a very important process, of course, because it was about victims giving their testimonies about what had happened. And
no, absolutely. So I would sit in those hearings and hear the relatives of the victims of violence by the security forces against anti-apartheid activists, and often the relatives would say, we want to know what happened, we want to know where the bodies are. And that was the time, I think, I really developed this need to know myself. I thought, well, I also need to know more about what happened to my family. And it was at that point that, in 1996, that I went to Washington, D.C., to an anthropology conference, and then went to the museum and got that information. And it was confirmation of what happened, because by then my father had died, so had his brother Arthur. And so this thing about when you start asking the questions, why is it always afterwards? Why didn't I ask my father when he was alive or when Arthur was alive? I don't know. I wasn't driven by the need to know. But I see the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a bit of a catalyst. It got me to think, well, what happened in relation to my own family?
But I'd like to stay for a while with this silence, because I find that the silence living in families who have experienced trauma, it doesn't necessarily have to be something like the Holocaust or something like the apartheid system and the violence there. But this silence is often very present. It's not an invisible silence, it's tangible, it's almost like an object following you around. Is this, can you recognize this, or am I just sort of...
Well, I think it follows some people around more than others, in a way. So even within one family there may be someone who becomes the archivist or the family historian.
Right,
and
here I am. Yeah.
So because I'm an anthropologist and, I studied at Columbia University and learned different methods of doing research, including oral history methods. I thought, well, I need to do an oral history of my own family. So that, I should mention, in 1989, I did do an interview with my father. I'd come home from New York for a holiday during the break, and he told me the story about how the family had moved from what is now Poland to Berlin after the First World War, when that part of Europe was returned to the Poles. And I got a sense of, the Rubinsky family history, and yet there were profound silences about what happened to the family. We never got there. And interestingly enough, in an interview recently, I was asked, well, did your father speak openly? And he did speak openly, but initially when I started the interview, he had said, well, why are you interested in this? And I had to persuade him that his story was important. So I think that generation, they came out, they were living in a refugee environment, they were all having similar experiences of devastating losses of their families, and they needed to get on with their lives. And there's an incredible letter that I came across from Rudy Rubinski, for example. He was a social democrat in Berlin in the early 30s, and of course the Nazis went for communists and social democrats very early. So he fled in 33 to Stockholm. So there's a letter from Rudy to my father saying, well, the family have been deported, just like you. What can we say? There's nothing we can say. But that's not why I wrote this letter. I would like to put forward a business proposition. And when I read it, I was like absolutely shocked. There was no space to grieve the loss.
No.
And and I've often thought about it. In those days, there was no such thing as trauma counseling or post-traumatic stress disorder. Trauma didn't exist in their language, I don't think, of people like my father. So it was a matter of not just trying to pick yourself up when you get out, but having to save the next one. So it was Edith, his sister, who was next in line after he managed to help Arthur get to South Africa, and then Arthur was given a few days in Cape Town. Then he eventually ended up being given permission to stay in northern Rhodesia, what is now Zambia. So the enormous pressures of just trying to rescue the family meant there was no real time to... and nobody else was interested necessarily. Other South Africans weren't necessarily interested. And that may be a contemporary situation about refugees. They land and the struggle begins around everyday needs.
Right. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the two of us who deal with this in books in different ways are the second generation. So we take this silence and put words to it. And this is what you're doing beautifully in this book. And we'll just touch upon the letters you mentioned as well, that you had them, but you came across over 100 letters or something about 100 letters. See if we can get a photo. Oh, here they are in a bigger...
Yeah, that's the photograph. Yeah. I'll quickly get to the letters.
Right.
This
is your father
in his later life. That's the shop they had in what is now Poland. Let's move on. Some of the documents when he fled. And then, can I just mention this?
Of course.
And then we can get on. I mean, it's quite extraordinary when you embark on this process. So you start with very little, and there are layers and layers of silence. So I had the photograph, then I had this list of where the family were deported to, the bare bureaucratic facts, not much else. And then I wrote a chapter in a book. It was an essay on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I included the story of going to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And we went to the publishers because they wanted to use the other photograph, the one of three women. And we took apart the frame, and behind it was this photograph. And that was the first photograph of my grandfather that I saw. Okay, I'll move on. No, we're going backwards. Oh, that's another story about... There we go.
There is a letter, right, from Berlin, 1939. And these letters that you came across by coincidence, they became a very important way of filling the silence, in a sense.
No, the letters were, I described it as a gift from the ancestors, because up till then, all I had were these bare bureaucratic facts, just names, birthplaces, and destinations of deportation, and the date, and so on. That was it. So no idea who these people were. No. The letters were extraordinary. It was a long process of transcription into modern German, then translation. But they gave me insights, particularly into my grandmother, and I learned who she was. And I could talk quite extensively on this process of retrieval.
Right.
because here I got a sense of the fears, desires, the ways of seeing and living of people who were, during a period from 33 until they were deported, were being systematically stripped down of livelihoods, professions, possibility to socialize in public spaces. The home became central, the streets were dangerous, and these letters reflected, the everyday mundane rituals of domesticity that my grandmother was involved in. And I think this is a story of women all over the world, probably right now in the Ukraine, in Syria, in various other parts of the world, where they have to hold the family together under these extraordinary situations of crisis or fragmentation, where family ties are being torn asunder. And through the mundane rituals, in this case it was Jewish festivals, Shabbat dinners, birthday celebrations, coffee and cake, my grandfather's card games, those small mundane rituals. I almost call it politics with a small p. It's what held them together. And in the letters you see this tension between her being the rock, the foundation, everything hinges upon her. She's stoic, she still has faith, and that perhaps God, she was quite religious, so maybe God will rescue them. They knew where things were going, and then sometimes she says maybe decent Germans will come to our rescue, or the international community. So she oscillates between, reporting on the everydayness of family life and the minutiae of these rituals of domesticity, and then impressing upon my father and Arthur how desperate things are getting. So, to cut a long story short, the letters become this extraordinary archive where I begin to understand who my family were. And I think it becomes a quite universal story in a way. And as I say, there are women elsewhere who are in that role.
And these letters went from Berlin to South Africa, and I think we will just do that trip as well in this talk, because your father being Jewish in South Africa, can you tell me something about what that was like? Because the South African government was actually pro-Nazi and pro-Nazi Germany.
Yes, yeah. So my father arrived in 1936 at Cape Town Harbour on the Stuttgart. He wasn't on the Stuttgart. 1936, Stuttgart arrived with 520 Jewish refugees from Germany, and there were protests at the harbour by fascist groups, Afrikaner nationalists who were supporting Germany, and they were calling for the stop to immigration route, no more refugees.
No more Jewish refugees.
No more Jewish refugees. It was called the Alien Immigration Act. And a professor at my university who later became the Prime Minister of the country, and he introduced the concept of apartheid. He was at the docks, and he wrote about the Jewish question. I mean, if I can find the slide.
So there's this direct link between the Nazi ideology, the anti-Semitism, and then the introduction of apartheid. This is sort of a first direct link, would you say?
Well, okay, so in the 1920s, there was quite a bit of poverty amongst white Afrikaners, and that was fertile ground for the mobilization around Afrikaner nationalism. So the seeds of what later becomes apartheid, already in place in the 1920s. And often Jews became the targets of that, that they were the source of the hardships of Afrikaners who lost their farms, and because Jews were often business people. They're often people who came from Eastern Europe, became small traders, like my great-uncle, Eugen. And so they became the target often for this mobilization. And you had groups such as the Brandfach, which they were overtly identifying with the Nazis, and they were anti-South Africa entering the war. So this is what my father encountered when he arrived. I mean, it must have been extraordinary. He fled after he had been arrested by the Gestapo in Germany already in 1933, and that had given him an insight into what was ahead. Took him 3 years, he manages to get to South Africa, and then finds these Nazis at the docks.
Like a welcome committee.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Then, to cut another long story short, what happens is after the war, the Afrikaner nationalists come to power in 1948. Mm-hmm. That's the big turning point. And they make a decision to clean up their act. So they realize Nazism is not going to work in a post-World War, or that kind of ideology is not going to work in a post-World War II period. So they come up with this term, separate development, and they leave the Jews alone. The Jews are no longer the problem.
So up until then, one could say that the Jews in South Africa were considered non-white.
You see, particularly, okay, let me mention that most South African Jews came much earlier. They came in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and they came largely from two places, from Latvia and Lithuania. And they arrived at the docks and they looked very other, very different. They were working class, they spoke Yiddish, they dressed strangely, they spoke strangely. So they were a problem. And there was a debate about whether they were really European or not. And because there was an earlier group of Anglo-German Jews who'd arrived and assimilated into the English liberal bourgeoisie, and they decided to lobby on behalf of these East European working class Jews to get Yiddish accepted as a European language and to facilitate this process of Jews becoming white. And people have written about that. So initially, because they looked so different, spoke Yiddish, they seemed very alien. But in that post-World War period, things shifted quite significantly, and the Prime Minister of apartheid South Africa went to Israel in 1948 and came back thinking, well, we're also the chosen people. So a massive shift occurred, and some Jews, South African Jews, just put their heads down and went along with this, became white without opposing the apartheid system, but others, and a significant minority ended up being very involved in the South African Communist Party, and Joe Slovo and others were part of the armed struggle.
In the front line of the armed struggle.
Yeah. A disproportionate number.
I think the time is moving very quickly. We could talk about each bit of this story for a much longer time, but I would like to just mention a German person who is important in your book and in history, Eugen Fischer. We have him on photo somewhere. Tell me about Eugen Fischer and his role in your story, Stephen.
Okay, if I can get this all moving. Okay, that's the letter from Rudy
Sweden,
Rubinski.
right.
Okay.
We're moving quickly here, but
Yeah.
time is also moving quickly, unfortunately.
Exactly.
So Eugen Fischer, why is he there in your book about your family?
It's quite a long story how I get there.
Yeah.
But when I was at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, I had seen this exhibit on Eugen Fischer, and he was a physical anthropologist, and he was a key eugenics scientist, and he'd done his postdoctoral work, and he published a monograph in 1908 on the so-called Rehoboth-busters, mixed-race people who'd been forced. They'd lost their land through racial wars, and they'd been pushed from a town called Williston, where my great-uncle was, and while doing some research around him, I stumbled across the fact that these people, mixed race people who'd been forced off the land, ended up in Namibia at a place called Rehoboth. That was the only place they could find sanctuary, thousands of kilometers, well, about 800 kilometers north of this town, Williston. Fisher does a study. It becomes a very important study in eugenics.
He comes from Germany, studies these people, and he calls them Mischling.
That's right, yeah.
Which is a term we recognize from...
Exactly. And he goes back to Germany, and in 1927 he's appointed the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity and Eugenics. And it becomes the key center for Nazi racial science, for classification of Roma, Sinti and Jews when they needed to work out how to slot people into these categories. And he becomes a key figure in the book, because I'm an anthropologist. I'm reflecting on the complicity of my own discipline in all of this. And you know, at a certain point, one of his protégés, Mengele, is sending blood samples from Auschwitz to the research center in Berlin. And so suddenly this story of eugenics became very important. This was a global science, it was a cosmopolitan science. Sweden was very much in the game.
Yes, we know about that.
Exactly.
Herman Lundqvist and rasbiologiska institutet. Yeah.
Exactly. And why it was so important, because then I began to understand why Jews like my family were trapped in Europe, because eugenics was used to influence immigration policy. So in 1924 already, in the US, eugenics advocates and scientists and activists got the immigration restriction law passed through Congress. So by using eugenics to claim that East European Jews were inferior, as were Southern Europeans, and we don't want them to mix our, dilute our Nordic racial purity, that had a direct consequence globally. So many countries shut their borders to Jewish refugees on that basis, this racial impurity idea. And in South Africa too, there was a point in 1936 where they were saying we cannot have more Jewish refugees. So, and then even in the letters, I began to see how my grandmother would mention, almost casually, in between talking about these mundane aspects of life, the celebrating birthdays and so on, she would mention a racial law, but in a coded way. She would say something like, from tomorrow, my middle name will be Sarah, and your father's middle name will be Israel.
Right.
From tomorrow or the next day, Dr. Cohen, a relative, can no longer practice as a doctor. So you begin to see how the 100 racial laws that were coming out of eugenics impacted on a particular family at an everyday level. So
we'll have to conclude, but I can conclude that this book connects all these different parts together. As you connect your family's different parts together, you also connect history, and you connect South Africa and its racial history with Nazi Germany and Europe today. So this is a big gift to us readers, I think. And thank you, Stephen Robbins,
thank you very much
for coming here and having this talk with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent.